family, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us online as well. Before we jump into our series, part 2 of our series called Day After Christmas, first I want to welcome everyone for being here. Thank you so much. If today is your first time, we are glad to have you here with us. And if you're watching online as well, we're glad that you're joining us. If you're here and you're new with us, there is a communication card on your seat. There's lots of ways you can get connected to Brave, and so if you have any questions about our church or ways that you can get connected, or we would love to hear from you, please make sure you fill that out, and at the end of our service today, you can just drop it off somewhere in Brave Central. That's just the lobby space in the back. Hand it to one of our serve team members, or you could drop it in one of our give bins if you want to get more discreet, but we'll contact you this week. We'll send you a text or give you a phone call. We'd just love to meet you and your family and answer, again, any questions that you have about our church. So thank you so much for being here. Next week, of course, is a big week for us. Sunday, December 22nd, that is our Christmas at Brave service. And so there are invite cards on the way out. I can just encourage you, and I certainly invite you to bring someone with you. We've said this phrase for a number of years here at Brave, and that is, if Brave has ever been a blessing to you, then be a blessing to somebody else and bring someone with you. And so that all kind of flows and rhymes together. So make sure you invite somebody. Bring them with you next week here, 10 a.m., just one service. And then on December the 24th, we're going to do our Candlelight Christmas Eve. That's always a great time to join us as well for that. So make sure you're here for that on the 24th at 5 p.m. That service is an all-inclusive, so everyone is in. We have childcare for the younger ones, but not for the older ones, but it's a kind of a family-friendly service, and so it lasts just under an hour, and that way you can get back home and have dinner or whatever it is you do on Christmas Eve. So hopefully you join us for that. And then tonight, if you have a student, 6th grade through 12th grade, they are doing their youth Christmas party. That is tonight, and so make sure you join them for that. If you have any questions about that, again, that information is available to you online, or talk to any serve team member in our church, and they'll make sure they get you the information or get you connected to someone who knows the answer to the question about our student ministry that happens on Sunday nights. And then finally, if you brought your tithes and offering in, of course, there's give bins on the way out. You can always give online. And then just to remind you of our compassion offering, this is a collection that we do every single year, and this goes towards different initiatives, which we talked about a few weeks ago back in the Love Your Neighbor series. And if you want to go learn more about that, you can go watch that on our YouTube channel or on our website, which is all connected there. And so this year, we're aiming towards $40,000 that goes towards all the different initiatives that we talked about. And so just as a reminder about that as well. And then to please, it kind of helps if you use the red envelopes, if you're giving in person towards that, that helps make sure it gets designated towards that. But then online, there's different boxes you can check to make sure that you give towards compassion versus general tithes and offerings. If you have any questions about that, again, talk to one of our serve team members. They'll be glad to help you out. All right. Well, today we are in part 2 of our series called The Day After Christmas. And if you have your sermon notes, you can grab those out. One of the things that you may not know about me, but I am a sports fan. I watch sports all the time. I am not a Hallmark Channel person, just so you know. And so for some of you who are just look forward to this season, I don't understand it, but that's all right. And so, yeah, I don't do reality TV. That's not me. An occasional Seinfeld episode, maybe, just to kind of go back to my young days, you know. But any Seinfeld fans? No? Okay. Yeah. Woo-hoo. All right. Yep. And so, yeah. Anyway, so a lot of sports. That's what I watch. It doesn't matter what sport it is. If there is a sport on, that's probably what I'm watching. And so one of the things that I know and you know about sports fans is that they all follow a team. Most of them follow some team. They have a team. And right now, of course, playoffs are about to start in football in a couple of weeks, and so you have a team. But then there's people who are sports fans, and they follow a team. They kind of like a team. They kind of, every once in a while look at the standings and try to follow certain teams in different categories. But then there's a whole nother level of a sports fan, and some of you know these, and some of you are married to these people, and they have more of an allegiance to a team. These are the people that, they wear the jersey, they've already got the jersey on, they had the jersey on last night, they paint their faces. These are the people who scream at the TV, they throw remotes at the TV, sometimes they cry when their team loses, they celebrate, like when their team scores a touchdown. If you've ever seen these people, they celebrate like they did the work to score the touchdown. They complain about the play calling. Anybody know anybody like that at all? Yeah. This is a whole nother level of sports fan, right? They have an allegiance to a team. And here's what those people are. Those people have gone from something, and some of you kind of fall in one of these categories as it relates to sports. They went from spectators to participants, right? They were that's what it is. Even in the audiences in some stadiums, people will call it like the 12th man. Have you ever heard of that? They'll call the crowd is so intense, man. That's like playing, and that's it. Because the crowd is not just there to spectate. They are there to participate. I mean, they make a difference in the game. And I see the head nodding. You're like, yes, yeah, that's what we do, yeah. Well, the same is true, and if you're new with us, or if you're just kind of checking out Christianity, you might have already picked up on this, but if you've been following Jesus for any length of time, you've probably noticed that the same kind of falls true as it relates to people who call themselves Christians. People call themselves Christians fall in one of two categories oftentimes. They're spectators and participants. The spectators often are known as believers. In fact, many of you have heard the term, they're believers, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, just hold on to that. But we often use this word believe, and we're going to kind of dive into that more today, this idea of believing in something. But there's a shift that happens when a person becomes a follower of Jesus. They move to a participant. There's somebody who doesn't just spectate any longer. They participate in what their king is doing, what the one they're following is doing. And the difference between the two, and you can write this into your sermon notes, is this. Believers think about entering in, while followers think about participating in. And let me help you understand that just a little bit more. Many of you have been taught or were taught or told that when you come to Jesus, it's about entering into something, entering into a place called heaven. And so for a lot of you, you've been taught or you were told or you said a prayer, and I was told this, and you know, if you want to get to heaven, you say these words, you say this, and then you get to enter into something. You get to enter into this place after you die. And so what happens is, for many of us, following Jesus or coming to know Jesus is all about the destination. It's like, well, that's what's going to get me into heaven. How do I get into heaven? The difference is when the word follower comes into play, which is the word that Jesus uses as he relates to people who follow him, his followers, they don't think about entering in as much as they think about participating in. All of a sudden, something shifts and changes from something I just believe in to something I'm a part of, something I participate in, something that goes beyond this idea of belief. This is what I want us to unpack today. Believers think about where they go when they die. Participants think about how they live while they're here. Believers tend to think about a kingdom they will arrive to one day, but followers or participants think about how do I get the kingdom here now? It's different. It shifts. This is where I want us to head today. And the problem is, when we reduce Jesus to someone who gets us in, rather than someone who invites us in to be a part of what he's doing, it changes everything. We miss out, actually, on the real story of Jesus. So as we talked about last week, the real story of Jesus begins with this, that a king is born. There was a king being born. It was a king, and it wasn't just like all other kings. This was a different king. This king was completely unique and different. He was a king who, and we mentioned this last week, a king who turned authority upside down. All of a sudden, authority was no longer about people serving him. It was about him serving his followers. Completely different king. And if you lived in that society, you know, and if you look back at history and you see Caesar and Rome and power and people who were in control, they were all about the people who served them. But Jesus came in as a king and said, that's not how it is in my kingdom. In my kingdom, I came to serve you. Completely upside down in regards to how you thought about authority. And many today, even people who lead their organizations, and if you know anybody who follows Jesus, how they lead their organization should look different than someone who leads it under a different kind of idea of authority, right? It just changes the game changer for everything. He was somebody who would replace retribution with love. He would say things like, love your enemies. Yeah. Of course, if you were a king in history in this time period and even today, if you have an enemy, what do you do to your enemy? You kill him. You take him out. You put him in prison. Jesus as king would say, that's not how it is in my kingdom. In my kingdom, the enemies, you love them and you bless them and you pray for them and you give to them whatever you can. Completely different view of authority, of kingship. He began a movement that the text would say, and still it's true, it would never end. That every king in history, when you go back to history, all the kings would die and fade away, and all their temples would corrode. We'll talk about that later. But his kingdom, he would say, would never end. His followers would continue to build and grow year after year after year for all eternity. And sure enough, that kingdom is still moving. His kingdom was completely different. And the reason this matters to understand, is because the reason we know about this king, this is why these two words are so important, is not because of believers. It's because of the participants. It's because of those who participated in what he was doing. The reason you sit here today, the reason why many gather all around the globe and all around the world, and the reason why you even have a Bible, the reason why you have a Bible app to go to, all of that, the story that has continued on, the reason why some of you know about a story about Jesus and a king, the only reason you know about that is because people didn't just believe. They moved to participants. They went from spectators to participators. In fact, if all you had was believers, you wouldn't know the story you know today. It shifts. It's something different. And today we're going to unpack that even more. So today we're in part 2 of our series called The Day After Christmas. I titled the message, Heaven Comes to Earth. We'll pick it up where we left off last week. There's a guy named Matthew, and he records the birth of Jesus this way and the day after Christmas this way. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Here's what the story unfolds as Matthew, one of the followers of Jesus, records it. He says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, we'll talk more about him today, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. The Magi are these wise men. Their job solely is people who study the stars. This is the job of the Magi, and many of you have heard, well, it's probably 3. It's likely it was more than that, but there's these group of men, we don't really know how many, who come together, and their whole job is to look at the stars, to look at creation, and make predictions. And make good, wise decisions. They would look up at stars, and they would count stars, and you know them. You look up and you see Orion, and you see all these different things, and they're piecing together how the Earth is moving, this is their whole job. And one day they notice a new star, and because they see this new star, they begin to identify it with a new king. There's a new king, and specifically, they make the prediction, they make the idea that there's a new Jewish king has arrived, based on a new star has appeared in the sky. We've never seen that one before. Therefore, a king must have been born. And so they do what made logical sense. They begin looking for a Jewish king. And to look for this Jewish king, guess where they go? They go to Jerusalem, because that's where the Jewish kings are. That's where Herod is. That's what would make sense. So they go to Jerusalem. They follow on verse 2, and it says, and ask, where is the one who's born king of the Jews? Their thought is, the Magi are thinking, hey, there's a new king. Now, Herod's king, we know that, but there's a new king here. There's a new king, and everybody should be talking about it. So where is he? Where is this new king? We saw his star. That means we understand how this works. A new star appears, there's got to be a king. When it rose and have come to worship him. They're not thinking what you think about Jesus today. They didn't know who Jesus was the way you know Jesus is today. They're just assuming this is a king, and we've come to serve and bow down to this particular king and to worship him. So then verse 3 says, when King Herod heard this, it says that he was disturbed. We talked about that last week. And so was all of Jerusalem with them. It means all the community is disturbed by this. And you would say, why is the community so disturbed? Why is Herod disturbed? Because this wasn't the birth of just a teacher. Remember this? This wasn't a birth of just a religious leader or a political figure. This was a birth of a king. And Herod knew it. The stars in the sky. And when he gets the wise men, the Magi, come to him who study the stars, and they say, we have seen a new star appear. Herod, and we talked about this more last week. Go back, and if you missed it, go back to that. But because Herod in this moment is aligning and connecting the dots that this king has come. And this is a greater king. And so, of course, he feels his potential of authority is potentially like he's going to get dethroned. And the people, this is important. Why is all Jerusalem disturbed? Because their threat to their king would mean this. And think about it. If their king falls apart, if their king gets brought down by some other king, what happens to a city? What happens to a community? You would know it as civil unrest, and you've seen this before. Civil unrest, when two people are fighting over power, civil unrest happens and eventually civil war. So the people are disturbed because if two kingdoms are coming into conflict, what does that mean for our community? What does it mean for our nation? What does it mean for us as individuals? And so there's disturbance all throughout Jerusalem because of this birth of this king, according to these wise men. So he does what makes logical sense. Verse 4, he called together all the people, chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he asked them, keyword, where is this Messiah to be born? The word Messiah, we said, was God's anointed one. The word Messiah simply means God's king. It was a title, it wasn't a person. It was the title for a person. And Herod acknowledges there's something unique about this child being born. This is Messiah. This is a king. This is God's king. So he uses that term, Messiah. Herod uses this Messiah term. And in doing so, it says, watch this. So they answer him. He knows about this today. He says, where is this person at? So they answer him and they say this, in Bethlehem, verse 5, in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. And he quotes Micah chapter 5. Written hundreds of years before this, a guy named Micah predicts this very moment in history. You got to hear that. That is so important to understand. There's a guy named Micah, you can read about it in the Old Testament, who predicts this very moment hundreds of years before this ever occurs. So they reach back into the text and they say, this is what Micah talked about. And then he quotes what Micah said, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler, and he'll shepherd my people, Israel. This is a huge statement in history when Micah predicts this, about 700 years prior. So in order to protect his own kingdom and his own legacy, this is King Herod, he had been in power for about 40 years, and now it's being threatened. So he does what naturally any king would do who feels threatened. Verse 7. So King Herod calls the Magi secretly, found out from the exact time the star had appeared. And last week we left off with this. He goes on, of course, the reason he does that is to find out, do you remember this? The child's age. When would it be about this child was born? And so then he goes and he commands all of these magi, all of these people, all of his soldiers to go and assassinate every single child under the age of 2 throughout the whole land. And of course, if you're hearing your king give you that order, you're wondering, are you sure, King Herod? Are you sure about what every single 2-year-old and under, every single male child? And the question that certainly you have to wonder about that in history, what would cause a king to assassinate every child under the age of 2 if he didn't feel threatened by another king? It's because Herod knew there was a king, and I cannot take any chances having my kingship, my authority, threatened. And so he does it, and he sends them out to assassinate many young boys under the age of 2. Powerful story. Here's a bit about Herod, just to kind of give you some backdrop to Herod. King Herod is king of the Jews. He's appointed king in 37 BC. He becomes king of the Jews, and this is important to understand. Religiously, he's Jewish. He's actually, from who he is as an individual, where he's born, where he's from, he's more culturally Greek. So he carries on a lot of Greek culture inside of him, but because his family eventually moves over to Jerusalem, he eventually marries into a family. He eventually becomes king of Jews. So religiously, he's Jew, and that's really important to understand. That means for Herod, when he looks into what Jews would look at, and you look at as the Old Testament, the first 5 books of the Bible, he goes by what that book says. He has no problem with the terminology of God. In fact, if you asked King Herod, do you believe in God? Absolutely. In fact, he would have been a rule follower. He would have been someone who went by what the book says to do. Because he was like many other Jews, and he's leading the Jews. And the reason why he's leading the Jews, and he's a religious Jew, is because he wants to be he wants to be good with the Jews. But at the same time, politically, he has relationship with Rome. So he's in this unique spot as an individual where he's in a perfect kingship in regards to the people he rules and the people he partners with, and he carries on some Greek culture. So he's got a lot of different things happening inside of him. One of the things that Herod was known for, and maybe some of you know this today, I think we have an image of it, is Herod's temple. This actually is a picture or kind of like a drawing of what the second temple would have looked like. Now, if you're a Jewish individual, you know the first temple was destroyed. Herod is the one who's appointed, this is so important to understand. Herod is the one who was appointed to build the second temple. In fact, he invested his own money to build the second Jewish temple. He put a lot at play to make this happen. And in the Jewish temple, if you go back and you read through the story of Leviticus, Herod creates this temple as a place where God dwells. This is where it was believed. This is where God's presence is. This is where you meet with the priest. This is where we break bread. This is where we come to meet the Creator. This is where the priests go to forgive us of our sins. And this is so important, this is where many sacrifices are made. And so, of course, they would sacrifice animals in order to get right with God. And so Herod, like many other Jews, would have been here often in order to participate in the sacrifices to get his own relationship with God right. When you think about that, this is so important to understand where King Herod is. Herod, this is so important, was willing to make sacrifices. But Herod, at the same time, refused to surrender to this king. He would make sacrifices to the king, but make him like the authority figure of his life? Never. Religious? Absolutely. Submission to authority? Absolutely not. Show up to church? Absolutely. Surrender to his kingship? Absolutely not. Herod, it's interesting when you study him. And I think there's a collision for us in this way too. Go to church, our relationship with God between me and him alone. Many of us think this way, that heaven is for later. This would have been Herod's perspective, by the way. Herod's perspective would have been, heaven is for later. Heaven is not for now. My job, my career, my path, my legacy. Herod's temple was then hopefully to display his legacy. It was to show the power of his kingship and his ruleship. He didn't build the temple thinking of how I carry it on, how I establish heaven now. It was about how do I get more fame for me. Completely different life this guy Herod lived. But after the first day of Christmas, after the very first day of Christmas, something changes. You can put it up. Keeping heaven separate from earth was no longer an option. Let me just say this to many of you in the room. For many of you, and it's not all your fault, I talked about this last, in some cases, it's just the way culture has taught about Christianity. In some cases, it's maybe what your parents taught. In many cases, it's what the churches have taught. That heaven is for later. Heaven is where we go, and that's what it's about, getting to a destination. And many, hey, just come enter a relationship with God now so you can go to heaven. Even when I was a teenager, some churches that I even went to as a teenager, as a young person, it was about, hey, you don't want to go to hell, you want to go to heaven, so come to know Jesus. This is about entering into something one day after you die. It was about a place you go. Heaven had this distant kind of thought that heaven was not something that can happen now. Heaven is something that happens way later. But I want to show you. For the followers of Jesus, those who would follow Jesus after Christmas, that is not how they would have perceived it to be. Keeping heaven separate from earth was no longer an option. Everything had begun to change. Heaven had come to earth in the form of a child, and everything had begun to change. Verse 8, it says this in Matthew 2:8, it says, he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report him to me. So of course, he's lying that I may go worship him too, but of course, Herod knows he's just trying to trap them to get him to eventually kill him. Verse 9, it says, we'll go right through these, after they heard the king, that is King Herod, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Just follow this. The stars in the sky had determined and responded to the birth of a child. When the stars move because of your birth, we'll pay attention to you. Until then, no, okay? When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Verse 11, it's going to throw off some of you. You're like, oh my gosh, I've been taught so wrong. Okay, ready? On coming to the house. They didn't show up to a manger. They didn't show up. I know you're like, oh no, I got to tear it down my front yard. Okay, so they didn't show up to a manger. They showed up to a house. This is likely about 6 months to maybe a year after the birth of Jesus. So this isn't just sweet little baby Jesus. All right, this is, that's a quote of a movie. All right, so this is a young Jesus. All right, this is a child Jesus. And they find him in this house, and they saw the child with his mother Mary, and look what they did. These men are men who are thinking, there's a king coming. The stars have moved because of this king, and they come, and as a result of seeing this king, you have to understand this. I know that the story propels it like, oh, they knew all this in advance. No. They show up in the presence of the king, and their posture changes. They bow down, and they worshiped this 1-year-old. What would cause men to fall on their faces to a 1-year-old child? Because when you're in the presence of a king, not much changes. When you're in the presence of the king, God's final king, the Messiah, you can't stand. They have no option. And they bow and they present him with gifts of frankincense and myrrh and all kinds of oils. And everything changes for this group of men. Something about this child caused them to change their posture. Later on, one of the followers of Jesus, his name is John, tried to describe Jesus and all of his interactions with Jesus when he lived with him and walked with him. He's trying to come up with identifying him and helping to you to understand what this man was like. And the only word he can use to define this interaction and this relationship as he traveled with this man, as he walked with this king, when this child would grow up through his teens and his 20s and into his 30s, he says, this is the only way I know to describe him. And he records it this way in 1 John. He says that God is love. What better word than to describe this one person? I cannot, in other words, describe him fully. I can only give you the word love because every time I was around him, that's all I felt. And it took over my life. And oh, John would even say, I am the one he loves. Oh, and to be in his presence. To serve this king was not about authority and power. It was about how much he loved me. And so he describes this king as love. Because Because, and John would do this, and so many others would do this. So many others, as they began to come to know this king in their life, things would change forever. Here's what would happen to all of his followers, as we're about to find out. When you meet a true king, you can put it up. When you've met the true king, your allegiance is to him and to him alone. In fact, John and many of his followers would give up their life to serve this king. And they would travel with this king and put their lives on the line, even though people were threatening them to be hanging around this king, to talk to this king. But they knew this is what being a part of this kingship would require. When you've met a true king, your allegiance to him and to him alone. In fact, about 40 years after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, this is so important to understand. Jesus would go on to die on the cross, as many of us know in the story, and then he raises from the dead. He comes back, and they see him front and center. And many begin to believe that he's king. In fact, they begin to believe he's the Messiah, he's king, he's the one that had been predicted about and talked about for hundreds of years by many different people. He's the king. He's God's king. This is him. And so they began to follow him, and word began to be spread about him. And ultimately, the story that was spread is about how he died on this cross, but more importantly, and so significantly, that 3 days after that, he came back to life. And what blew their mind is the same thing that kind of even today wrecks my mind, is that he predicted his own death and predicted his resurrection. And as a result of that, they begin to say, if you can predict your death and predict your resurrection, and it happens just the way you said, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to pay attention to everything you say. So they began to follow him. And then eventually, in a city called Antioch, a new term would be created. A term that had never been used before in history. A new word would happen, right? And I know there's a lot of new words out there today. I'm learning them all the time, you know. Okay. That's one way I know I'm getting older. I'm learning new terms, all right? So, in Antioch, a new term was created, and it goes like this. It says this in Acts chapter 11. It says, then Barnabas, don't worry about the people. This is just what happens. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for a guy named Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to a place called Antioch. This is the important part. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church. And they began to teach and taught great numbers of people all about the story that I just told you. They're teaching people about this resurrection of this man named Jesus who died years ago, and this all things happening a couple of hundred years later. And all this communication is happening, and wow, you should hear this story, this Jesus. Then he died and he rose from the dead. And then so people started to try to figure out, what do we call these people? What do you call the people that are following this guy and listening to his teachings and reading about him and trying to mimic his ways? So the disciples at that time were called Christians, first at Antioch. It was a Greek phrase, Christanos, which was actually more of like a derogatory statement. It was a way of mocking somebody, a way of making fun of somebody, saying you're trying to be like that guy Christ. Remember, Christ was not a person. That's not a last name. Christ was a title for Jesus. What does Christ mean? God's King. So here you have these Christanos, these followers of the Christ, these followers of Jesus who was named the Christ, given the title Christ, the anointed one, the Messiah, God's King. And so today, you know many of this terminology is about this word Christians, and that's where it came from, Acts chapter 11. First Christians called this followers of Christ. Followers of Christ began a new movement. This was way bigger than a political movement. This was way bigger than just choosing a particular side. These followers of Christ began a new movement, a movement that pledged allegiance to a king. This is what threatened Herod, and this is what threatens so many other kings, and this is what threatens so many to this day. If you choose to serve allegiance to him, then you're not serving allegiance to me, and I can't have that. And so all around the world today, many people are still murdered and killed because they've pledged allegiance to a king versus the one who thinks they're king. Still happens today. Pledging allegiance to a king. And they knew what you know, what it means to serve a king. They knew that this king required what every king requires: allegiance and obedience. And they gladly made him their king. Money wasn't their king. A career path wasn't their king. They gladly chose. And Herod certainly wouldn't be their king. No. Rome? No. Other political figures and leaders in history? No. We have one king, and our allegiance is to him. And we seek obedience to one, to the point of death. Followers of Jesus, Christians, looks a little different than maybe what some of you have been told about what it means to be Christian, and how we use it so loosely today, and how we click it on a button when we select a religious affiliation. You can click a button of religious affiliation, and you can make the sacrifices like Herod without ever really making him king. Different. The Christians in Antioch weren't changing their religion. They weren't shifting from one religion to another. They were changing their allegiance. When the Christians walked around Jerusalem and King Herod had just slayed every child under the age of 2, what would it require of you to say, I pledge allegiance to that king? But they did it anyway. Makes you think about what's changed. Culture, churches. What's evolved today? How we see Christians and Christianity so differently. For these Christians, for these followers of Christ, Acts chapter 11, here's what happened. A new kingdom had come. And in their kingdom, this was so different in that culture. It was like a dog-eat-dog world, right? It was about keeping all your competitors at bay and you always trying to climb the ladder above everybody else. No. In their kingdom, this is how they saw people, as brothers and sisters. All of a sudden, neighbors had shifted to people who were like me. And their king would say, you've got to love them the way you love yourself. So treat them as brothers, sisters. We don't even talk to our neighbors. I don't even know our neighbor. Like, you mean you want me to love them, anyone I come into contact with? Yeah. That's how it is. Jesus would say, in my kingdom, we're family. And when you hurt, I hurt. When you suffer, I suffer. And when you rejoice, I rejoice. And if you need, and this is so beautiful to see, you can go read about it in Acts chapter 2. When they saw other brothers and sisters hurting, you know what they did? How can I meet your need? How can I help brothers and sisters? And their king, and this was brand new in the culture, by the way. If you're women's rights stuff, like, woo, women's rights, pay attention, this is awesome. Jesus in his kingdom was the first one who said, all equal. Because all the other kings who had reigned and ruled prior to that were suppressing women. Jesus said, no, daughters too. And he would call men to surrender, to submit, and to be a part of in communion with their brides. Oh man, he raised the stakes. So he would say, men and women are equal in the eyes of God. This is Jesus and their kingship. And they began to adopt a brand new way of living in that culture. And in many cases, they would call themselves servants. The people, these Christians who would walk around, they would say they are here to serve enemies. They're here to serve one another. They would not walk around saying, serve me. They would say, I'm actually here to wash your feet because that's what my king did for me. That's what I've got to do for you. I'm here to serve you. How can I help you and serve you, serve you, serve you, serve you, serve you? How can I give to you, give to you, give to you, give to you, give to you? I'm looking for ways to give. I'm looking for ways to serve because that's what my King requires of me. Man, powerful. This was not a religion. This was a revolution. The day after Christmas, this was a brand new way of living. And thousands upon thousands bought in. And they believed he is king. Christians in Antioch didn't believe in his kingdom. They participated in his kingdom. Because they knew, and here's what they knew. This is so central to the whole point of the day after Christmas. This is so central to us today. They knew what Herod knew. And they knew what Mary had known. They'd become to realize this truth. And they saw, they knew, and they heard the story about Jesus' ascension and his resurrection. And so they knew that Jesus was, in fact, God's king. This is God's appointed king over all kings. And that he would have all authority on heaven and on earth. And he's king. Which means Jesus is still king. Jesus is God's final king. Still. So the question, the day after Christmas, the day after the first Christmas, when this child is born, that this story prompts us to question and has to kind of ask us, and we have to kind of ask ourselves, at least just ponder, or I invite you to at least consider, is Jesus my king? It's one thing to say you believe in Jesus, but so did many others. Completely different to make him your king. So is he? Is he my king? I have another way of asking it. Is he your king? Is he your king? Is he a religious leader? A wish granter? A bail bondsman? Or is he your king? Can you pledge allegiance to him? These first followers at Antioch and many Christians around the world today say yes. Why does that matter so much? And let me just close it with this thought. The reason why, and if you're a follower of Jesus, this is important, because if you've said, I'm a follower of Jesus, then I don't want you to think about this, and even if you don't follow Jesus, but you like the principles of Jesus, or maybe the way that they're supposed to live, you're like, I haven't really seen a lot of people who live that way, but the way Jesus lived, yeah, that kind of makes sense. All right, this is why this is so important. It's because we can't bring his kingdom. We pray about his kingdom. We want to get to heaven. Oh, heaven's this glorious, awesome place. Jesus would say, then pray for my heaven to come to earth now. How's that going to happen? Through my followers. How you treat one another, how you love one another, how you care for one another. This is how people will know that I am God. You want people to find out that I'm king? Go love your brothers and sisters. Treat people equally. Serve one another. Pray for those who hurt you. Be as generous as you possibly can be. This is how you let people know about my kingdom. And you can't bring his kingdom to earth without first choosing to make him your king. So if you want to see his kingdom on earth, pledge allegiance to the king. Make him your king. And this is the invitation, and this is the part that's so cool about Jesus. He never imposed his will as king. He invited people to participate in it. He didn't force his way for his followers to come. Every single human, every single person, young and old, could choose for themselves who they would. And today, the invitation, again, is wide open. To make him the king. Not just someone you enter into a place with one day, but someone you make your king now. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for the opportunity. Can't help but to think how you put this down in a book, recorded this, so we could go back, read about it, and learn about it. And I can't help but to think about all the attempts in history to take that book out, to discredit the book. It's a story all about you. What's fascinating is your story continues to be told around the world. And so many lives have been transformed because of your story. Hope is found. If you're hopeless today, Jesus would say, when you come follow me, hope is restored. He redeems. He brings back all things thought were dead. He would say things like, with me, all things are possible. If today joy has been lost, he would say things like, your peace can be found in me. In a communion, in a relationship with me, peace is restored. He would say things like, if you want to find life, like real life, like the meaning of your life, Jesus would say, that's why I've actually come, that my children would know life, and life to the fullest. The invitation is wide open today. Maybe today you've been actually following Jesus for a long time. You actually believe in him, and you've believed in him for a long time. You'd say, I've believed in him. Attended church, did the religious thing, but today a new word has arose in your spirit, and it's the word king. And today is a decision for you to make him your king and to submit and surrender to his authority, to pledge allegiance and obedience to him. That's you today. Just say, that's me. I want to make him my king. Maybe today you're new with us and you're just learning about Jesus for the first time, but you've never heard this story, but his spirit is moving in your heart, and you want to make the decision today just to follow him. I've always said this, you don't have to understand everything about Jesus. Follow Jesus. You don't have to know the Bible to begin to follow and learn about Jesus. But today, that's you. And any one of the things that I just spoke about, would you just lift your hand wherever you are? I just want to pray for you and pray. Would you pray this with me, church? Those who are making decisions in this room, just say, Jesus, I make you my king today. I'm just going to give you a minute privately. If today you need to re-solidify your relationship with him and make him your king over a certain area of your life, maybe it's over your finances, maybe it's over your job, your career path, just tell him, I surrender. He's a loving king. He does not come to condemn you, but he comes to save and restore and redeem. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Well, thank you for joining us for part 2 of our series. We're going to have a prayer team down front. If those who are part of the prayer team would come down. Before you move too fast, hold on one second. I know people are moving in their places. Can I just say this? I know. Prayer team? That's you. Yes, thanks. Okay. If you need prayer today, Jesus one day would say his house would be a house of prayer. Look, don't leave here. If you need prayer for something, health, job, marriage, kids, families coming into town, you're like, please, someone just pray with me about how I'm going to handle it. We want to pray with you. No matter too big, too small. We would love to stand with you. That's why we do this each and every week. We have people up here ready to pray with you, stand with you. If you have a question about faith, about Jesus, if you just need a Bible, we want to be here to stand with you about that. Doesn't matter how long you've come here, by the way. You could have come here for a year. Yep. If you need prayer, we're here for you too, okay? And then next week, of course, we'll be back for our Christmas service at 10 a.m. I encourage you, if Brave has ever been a blessing to you, if God has used Brave Church to bless you in many ways, bring someone with you. I read this stat. I got this stat texted to me by one of our staff members yesterday. Shelly, she's at home, sick, and she said, I want you to mention this. So I'm going to honor her in this moment. She said, she sent us this stat, and oh gosh, Shelly, I'm sorry. I promise I have the text somewhere on here. Hey, here it is. This was the stat she wanted me to share with you. Shelly serves on our staff, and she normally does the host segment, so I hope I'm doing a good job, Shelly. Here's what she said. 82% of people who would come to church, it says 82% of people would come to church if a friend invited them. But only 2% of Christians invite friends. And she says this would be really good for the announcements to tell people to invite people for Christmas. Well, I did it. 82% of the people will actually say yes if you can just be courageous enough and invite them this Christmas season. Look forward to seeing you all next week for part 3 of our series, The Day After Christmas. Take care. We love you. God bless.